When freedom of information first came in, there were no costs involved, and some journalists, including myself, got fairly enthused about it. Then they imposed costs. They imposed costs, first of all, right at the beginning. You had to put in an application fee, which at the Commonwealth Government level is about $30. And then you had to pay further fees for the cost of looking for the document, and in some cases for the cost of considering whether they would give the document out to you. That's proved to be a major disincentive, not just for journalists, but for other researchers, such as academics, to use the Freedom of Information Act. There is scope within the Act to ask for public interest exemptions, but the tendency is for government to say, you're a journalist, you're in the business of selling information, that information has a value to you, therefore even if it is in the public interest, you ought to pay your fair share for the cost of retrieving it.
So is accessibility limited, would you say? Or?
Well, it's limited in two ways. I mean, by itself, fees frighten people off. They frighten them from asking, and in some cases you ask and you pay a minor fee, say $30, and they write back to you and say, yes, well, you can have it probably, but we haven't really thought about it yet, and it will cost you $600 for the next stage. And you think to yourself, can I really justify another $600? And you say, no, don't do it. But they also operate as a substantial disincentive as well to pursuing your rights to appeal, because then you have to pay even more fees, so that it means that if they make a decision adverse to you, it's less likely to be appealed. A lot of journalists think that it's too hard, too complicated, too much trouble, and just don't bother.
So you've used the Act in writing stories yourself?
Yes, I was a very early and consistent user of the Act, and in the early years of the Act I suppose I made probably 500 separate applications. I took over 50 cases to court, and I acquired some reputation as a person to be not to be too much trafficked with. One effect of that was that for a lot of the next few years I didn't really have to officially use the Act. You could ring up a public servant and say, look, I could ask for this under the Act, but I'm going to get it anyway. Let's stop buggerising around, not having the form filling, just give me the documents. And it was amazing how often they would. And even now I would insist that one of the good results of FOI, in spite of the disincentives in fees, was the fact that it actually did change a lot of the attitude of public servants. There's a lot more material which is now generally accessible without asking many questions. However, for a long time I wasn't much using the Act. 12 years have passed. In some ways the shutters have come down again. I'm now using the Act a lot more again. I'm now finding that to some extent you have to train a new generation of public servants that this is not some grace or favour operation, but is a matter of right. So I've been starting to take a few cases to court again just to prove that the Act has some teeth, even if it's not as strong as I would like.
Do you have some examples of documents that you've retrieved?
Yes, we've just fairly recently won a case in the courts about access to freedom of information documents. This is one case here, which was a Canberra Times case, which was fought. And this is part of the case that we actually won, but you will see from those black spaces in it that there's still substantial materials that are deleted. In fact, we won the case almost absolutely, and in spite of what you might see there, because we had gone in admitting that there was a privacy issue of somebody's privacy and saying we did not want material about that. What we wanted was about the principle involved. If you look back more generally at the history of the Act, I suppose there have been a number of occasions when freedom of information has made a big difference. The case in which I was most closely involved what was known as the Army land grab, which was when the Army wanted to buy 200,000 hectares of land around Bathurst and Orange and about 2 million hectares of land around Cobar in western New South Wales. Now, there were a lot of very angry landowners who didn't want that, But the army was to some extent able to portray them as selfish individuals who were, putting their own interests ahead of the national security. We put in Freedom of Information Act requests about it, which showed that even within the defence system there were very substantial questions asked about, do we really need this? Is this really what we're on about? Is this really where we're going? That effectively blew the Army's case for this land grab out of the water. Now, some people talk about the cost to the administrative system of FOI, but as a result of this, the Army itself withdrew from these land purchases and saved the Australian government taxpayer about $500 million. The Army itself would now admit that they should never have done it and that it was not a good idea. But they would have spent that money without a doubt. Now, I would argue that that by itself is paid for the cost of freedom of information. There have been other instances where FOI on one occasion led to the downfall of a federal government minister. John Brown was shown to have misled the Parliament from FOI. So it is being used by journalists, but to some extent, but not nearly enough.
FOI is best if you know a document exists, if you've had a tip-off from someone that if you go and look in such and such a place, if you ask for such and such a file, ask for a document of that title, well, then they will have to hand it over, except, of course, it falls into a category which they're able to protect, and that often happens as well, because it might be a commercial in confidence document, it might have security implications, it might bear on a staffing matter, a personal matter about an individual who's employed, and in the end, if the government really wants to avoid handing over a document, a minister's able to sign a certificate to the effect that it is not in the interests of the public to hand it over, and it won't be handed over.